I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a suburban war zone. But that's exactly what happened when I bought my first home in the quiet community of Willow Creek in Fresno, California. The moment I signed those mortgage papers, I unwittingly entered the battlefield of Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, commanded by none other than Karren Williamson, a woman whose dedication to property values had veered dangerously into obsession. My name is Xavier Morgan, and this is the story of how my simple dream of homeownership turned into a 2-year nightmare that eventually landed a power-hungry HOA president in legal hot water. I still remember the spring day I moved in. April 15, 2023. Tax day. Perhaps that should have been my first omen. The California sun was beaming down as I unloaded the last of my boxes from the U-Haul. My new home wasn't extravagant, a modest 3-bedroom ranch style with a small front yard and a slightly larger backyard, but it was mine, and that's what mattered. "You must be the new owner," came a voice from behind me as I struggled with a particularly heavy box of books. I turned to see a woman in her mid-50s, perfectly highlighted blonde hair styled in what I'd later learn was her signature sharp bob. She wore beige capri pants and a light blue button-up blouse that seemed pressed to military precision. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which were busy scanning my belongings. "That's right. Xavier Morgan," I said, extending my hand after setting down the box. "Karren Williamson, HOA president." She shook my hand with a grip that conveyed authority rather than welcome. "I trust your realtor provided you with our community guidelines." "Yes, I've got them somewhere in these boxes," I replied, gesturing to the chaos of my move. "Well, you'll want to unpack those first. We take our standards very seriously here in Meadowbrook." Her eyes darted to the U-Haul. "That vehicle needs to be gone by sundown. No commercial vehicles overnight. Page 7, Section 3 of the guidelines." And with that, she handed me a freshly printed copy of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA regulations, all 37 pages of them, and walked away, her sandals clicking rhythmically against the pavement. Little did I know this was just the opening salvo in what would become an all-out war. The first month passed relatively uneventfully. I settled into my new job as a software engineer at a local tech startup, working mostly from home. I made a point to read through the HOA guidelines and tried to follow them to the letter. Trash bins out only on collection day and removed by 8 p.m. No visible yard equipment. Lawn maintained to a specific height. The list went on, but I wanted to be a good neighbor. My first real confrontation with Karren came in late May when I decided to plant some vegetables in my backyard. I'd always wanted a small garden, and the California climate seemed perfect for it. I spent a Saturday morning setting up raised beds for tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. I was watering my newly planted seedlings when I heard the distinct clearing of a throat from over my fence. Karren stood there, iPad in hand, peering over into my yard. "Mr. Morgan, I couldn't help but notice you've installed agricultural structures in your yard." I looked at my modest wooden raised beds in confusion. "These are just some small garden boxes." Section 12. Paragraph 4 clearly states that all landscape modifications must be approved by the architectural committee, she said, scrolling through her iPad to show me the exact wording. Those structures were not approved. "They're just boxes for growing some vegetables," I explained, trying to keep my tone friendly. "They're not visible from the street or anything." "Rules are rules, Mr. Morgan. I'll need you to remove them until proper approval is obtained. The committee meets next month." With that, she took several photos of my garden and walked away. Rather than fight, I decided to submit the proper forms. 3 weeks later, I received a denial of my request. Reason: agricultural pursuits not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Meadowbrook Estates. That was the first time I felt real frustration with the HOA, but I dismantled my garden boxes, not wanting to rock the boat. I later learned from my neighbor, Leonard Thompson, that Karren had blocked similar requests from at least 5 other homeowners in the past year. "She's got this vision of perfect uniformity," Leonard explained as we shared beers on his patio one evening. "God forbid anyone express individuality." Leonard, a retired high school principal in his 60s, had lived in Meadowbrook for over a decade and had his own history with Karren. "Just wait until she starts with the violation notices. She does her inspections every Thursday like clockwork." True to Leonard's warning, the first violation notice appeared on my door in June. "Unauthorized wind chime on front porch, $50 fine. Please remove immediately." I hadn't even realized the small bamboo chime my sister had given me as a housewarming gift was against regulations. I checked the guidelines again and found, buried in Section 18, a prohibition against audible decorative elements visible from community spaces. I removed the wind chime and paid the fine, but that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I received notices for excessive bird feeding. I had one small feeder in my backyard. Improper window covering. I had left my bedroom blinds open during the day. An unapproved door color. The door was the same color it had been when I bought the house. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine increased my resentment. But the situation truly escalated on the 4th of July. I had invited a few friends over for a small barbecue. Nothing wild, just 6 people, some burgers and music playing at a reasonable volume. At precisely 8:02 p.m. there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Good evening, sir. We received a noise complaint from the neighborhood," one officer explained. I was stunned. "A noise complaint? We're just having a small get-together. The music isn't even that loud." The officers were understanding after surveying the situation. "Looks pretty reasonable to me," the younger officer said, "but we have to respond to all calls. Maybe just keep an eye on the volume as it gets later." They left without issue, but as they walked back to their patrol car, I noticed Karren watching from her driveway 3 houses down. When she saw me notice her, she quickly went back inside. My friend Lucas, who works as a paralegal, shook his head. "That's ridiculous. It's not even dark yet, and it's the 4th of July. "Welcome to life under Queen Karren," I sighed, turning down the music slightly anyway. The next day, I received another violation notice. "Unauthorized social gathering exceeding noise limitations. $100 fine." This time, I decided to contest the fine. I attended the next HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse. About 20 neighbors were present, with Karren presiding at the front table alongside the HOA treasurer, a nervous-looking man named Walter, and the secretary, Linda Vincent, who seemed perpetually apologetic about everything. When it came time for homeowner comments, I calmly explained that my gathering had been small, the music reasonable, and that even the police had found no issue. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Karren's response was swift and cutting. "The police are not the arbiters of our community standards, Mr. Morgan. Our regulations clearly state that gatherings exceeding 4 non-resident guests require prior board notification. Additionally, amplified music outdoors is prohibited after 7 p.m. on holidays." I checked the guidelines later and found no such specific regulations. When I emailed Linda about this discrepancy, she apologetically informed me that these were unwritten understandings within the community. My fine stood, and my frustration grew. August brought a heat wave to Fresno, with temperatures climbing above 100 degrees for days on end. My air conditioning unit, which had been struggling since I moved in, finally gave out completely. I called an HVAC company who could come the next day, meaning I'd have to endure one sweltering night. To make it somewhat bearable, I set up a portable air conditioning unit in my bedroom, which required venting through the window. I used the manufacturer's window kit, which involved a temporary plastic panel. By 10 a.m. the next morning, the HVAC technicians had arrived and were working on replacing my unit. At 10:30 a.m., so did the police. We received a report of unauthorized construction and potential code violations. The officer explained, looking somewhat embarrassed to be there. I explained the situation, showed them the HVAC professionals with their proper licensing, and they quickly left, but not before Karren happened to walk by with her dog, documenting everything on her phone. When the new AC unit was installed, I received a violation notice for failure to obtain architectural committee approval for exterior modification. The fact that it was the same model and in the same location as the previous unit apparently didn't matter. But what truly pushed me over the edge came in September. I had to travel to Seattle for a week-long conference for work. My younger sister, Lisa, agreed to house sit and take care of my cat. On the second day of my trip, I received a panicked call from her. "Xavier, the police are here. They say there's been a report of an unauthorized occupant and potential break-in." I was furious. I explained to Lisa to show the officers her ID and explain she was my sister watching my house. When I called her back later, she told me the officers had been understanding but clearly annoyed at being called out for nothing. Upon returning home, I found 3 separate violation notices: unauthorized occupant, failure to notify HOA of property vacancy, and improper vehicle parking. My sister had apparently parked slightly over the edge of my driveway one night. That was when I decided I needed to start documenting everything. I installed security cameras covering my front yard, driveway, and backyard. I saved every communication from the HOA. I started recording dates and times of Karren's inspections of my property, which had increased to almost daily walk-bys. I also began talking more with my neighbors. It turned out I wasn't alone in my frustration. Leonard introduced me to Maria Gonzalez, who lived on the corner and had received violations for her ethnic garden ornaments. They were standard garden gnomes. Then there was the Jackson family, who had been fined because their children's basketball hoop was visible from the street, and elderly Mrs. Peterson, who had been cited for hanging bird feeders in her oak tree. Karren wasn't always this bad, Leonard explained during one of our now regular evening talks. She got on the board about 5 years ago, and things were okay at first. But after she became president 3 years ago, it's like something switched. Now it's like she's on a power trip. "Has anyone ever challenged her?" I asked. "A few have tried. The Donaldsons moved out last year after she kept reporting their teenage son's friends for parking violations. And remember the house at the end of the cul-de-sac that was empty for months? The owner, Jim Buchanan, was in a full-out war with her until he just gave up and sold." October brought new tensions. I had put up some modest Halloween decorations, just a fall wreath and a few small pumpkins on my porch steps. Nothing compared to some of the elaborate displays in neighborhoods without HOAs. One evening, returning from work, I found a police officer at my door, Mr. Morgan. "We received a report about unauthorized items obstructing a public walkway," he said, looking at my pumpkins with obvious confusion. I sighed. "Let me guess, Karren Williamson called. The officer's professionalism couldn't quite hide his slight eye roll. "I'm not at liberty to say who reported this, sir. This is the third time this month the police have been called to my house for trivial matters," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I understand your frustration," the officer replied quietly. "Just so you know, we have to respond to all calls, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Some addresses do start to get noted in our system when we receive frequent calls that don't result in actual issues." That conversation was illuminating. Karren wasn't just harassing me through the HOA, she was actively weaponizing the police as her enforcement arm. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA board imposing a $150 fine for seasonal decorations exceeding permitted dimensions. I decided it was time to attend another HOA meeting, this time better prepared. I brought printouts of the HOA guidelines highlighting that my decorations were well within the permitted parameters. I also brought a record of the police calls to my address and statements from neighbors attesting to the reasonableness of my property maintenance. The meeting was tense from the start. Karren seemed agitated even before I spoke, constantly shuffling papers and whispering to Walter. When my turn came to speak, I calmly presented my case. The guidelines clearly state that seasonal decorations not exceeding 2 feet in height are permitted on porches. My pumpkins were standard size, under that limit. Additionally, I'm concerned about the frequent calls to police for trivial matters, which is wasting public resources. Several neighbors murmured in agreement. Karren's face flushed red. "Mr. Morgan, your interpretation of the guidelines is incorrect. The 2-foot limit applies to the total combined height of all decorations," she said. I pointed to the exact wording, which clearly indicated otherwise. Linda, the secretary, looked uncomfortable. "He does seem to be right about the wording, Karren." Karren's eyes flashed with anger. "Fine. The fine is rescinded, but I'll remind everyone that the board has final interpretive authority on all guidelines." I considered it a small victory, but I knew the war was far from over. November and December brought a temporary truce. I kept my holiday decorations minimal, precisely measured and within guidelines. Karren seemed to shift her focus to other neighbors, particularly the new family that moved in across the street, the Thompsons, with their 2 young children, who had committed the grievous sin of leaving bicycles in their driveway overnight. January 2024 marked the beginning of my second year in Meadowbrook, and with it came rain, lots of it. California was experiencing one of its wettest winters in years, and Fresno was no exception. My backyard, which sloped slightly toward the fence, developed some minor puddles after heavy rainfall. One particularly stormy morning, I was working from home when I heard a knock at my door. Opening it, I found Karren and a man I didn't recognize standing under umbrellas. "Mr. Morgan, this is Frank Willis, our HOA consulting engineer," Karren announced. "We've received reports of improper drainage from your property causing community concerns." I looked out at the pouring rain in disbelief. "What community concerns? It's a rainstorm." "Your property is not properly graded, causing water to pool against the community fence, which could lead to structural damage," Frank explained, sounding like he was reading from a script. "The fence is fine," I argued. "And everyone's yards have puddles right now. We're in the middle of a storm." "We'll need to inspect your backyard," Karren insisted. "No," I said firmly. "Not now in this downpour, and not without proper notice as required in Section 5 of the HOA bylaws regarding property inspections." Karren's eyes narrowed. "Very well. Expect formal notice." They left, but not before Karren took several photos of water running down my driveway, just like it was doing on every driveway on the street. 2 days later, I received not only a formal inspection notice, but also a violation for improper landscape drainage causing potential damage to community property, with a $250 fine. I contested this violation as well, armed with photos of multiple properties with similar drainage patterns and documentation from the original property survey showing my land grading was to code. At the February HOA meeting, I presented my case again, this time with even more neighborhood support. Several homeowners spoke up about Karren's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. The meeting grew heated when Lillian Vasquez, a retired civil engineer who had recently moved to the community, questioned the credentials of the consulting engineer and asked to see reports of the supposed damage to the community fence. The board is not obligated to provide such documentation to general members, Karren retorted. Actually, Lillian countered, Section 8 of the California Davis-Sterling Act requires HOA boards to provide access to all records upon which enforcement actions are based. The room went silent. Karren clearly hadn't expected to encounter someone who knew the law better than she did. My fine was temporarily suspended pending further investigation, which I took as another small victory. After the meeting, Lillian approached me. "I've seen this type of behavior before in other HOAs," she said. "When people get a little power, some don't know how to handle it responsibly." Lillian became a valuable ally. In her mid-60s, with a no-nonsense attitude and a wealth of knowledge about property law from her engineering career, she helped me understand that many of Karren's actions weren't just annoying, they might actually be violating state laws governing HOAs. March brought a new level of escalation. I had started parking my car in different positions in my driveway, always fully on my property and in compliance with regulations, but not always in the same spot. It was a small act of rebellion, I admit. One evening, returning from the gym, I found my driver's side mirror damaged, clearly hit by something. My security camera had captured Karren walking by with her standard clipboard earlier that day, stopping near my car, but the angle didn't show clearly what had happened. The next morning, there was a police car outside my house. The officer explained they'd received a report that I had damaged a neighbor's vehicle and fled the scene a hit and run. "That's ridiculous," I said. "My car was parked here all day yesterday except when I went to the gym for an hour." The officer took my statement, and when I showed him my security footage of my car parked all day and the damage that appeared while I was gone, he seemed to connect the dots without me having to spell it out. "This isn't the first call we've had from this neighborhood that turned out to be." "Not exactly as reported," he said carefully. "I'll note in my report that there's no evidence supporting the hit-and-run claim." As he was leaving, he paused. "Just out of curiosity, how many times have the police been called to your house since you moved in?" I thought about it. "This is probably the 10th or 11th time in the past year." He raised his eyebrows. "That's unusual for a quiet neighborhood like this." That conversation gave me an idea. The next day, I visited the Fresno Police Department and filed a public records request for all police calls to my address since I had moved in. While I was there, I decided to expand my request to include all calls from Karren Williamson's phone number, which I had from HOA communications. April brought a surprise opportunity. The HOA was holding its annual board elections, and positions were open for new members. Encouraged by Lillian and several other neighbors who had grown tired of Karren's reign, I decided to run for a board position. My campaign was simple: transparency, reasonable enforcement, and community focus rather than punitive actions. I printed simple flyers and went door to door, meeting neighbors I hadn't yet encountered and hearing even more stories about Karren's overreach. The election meeting in late April was the most well-attended HOA meeting in Meadowbrook's recent history, according to Leonard. Nearly 60 homeowners showed up, compared to the usual 15 or 20. Karren looked visibly nervous as she called the meeting to order. When it came time for candidate statements, I kept mine positive and forward-looking, never directly attacking Karren but emphasizing the need for a collaborative rather than confrontational approach to community standards. The tension in the room was palpable during the voting process. When the results were tallied, I had won a position as board secretary, replacing Linda, who had decided not to run again. Karren retained her presidency by only 3 votes, the closest margin in years according to Walter, who also kept his treasurer position. Karren's congratulations to me were icy at best. "I look forward to showing you how much work actually goes into maintaining our community standards," she said, her smile tight. My first board meeting in early May was eye-opening. Behind closed doors, Karren was even more controlling than I had imagined. She shot down every suggestion I made for improving communication with homeowners. When I questioned the need for some of the more nitpicky regulations, she dismissed me entirely. "You've been a homeowner for barely a year, Mr. Morgan. When you understand the complexities of property value maintenance, perhaps your opinion will carry more weight." Despite the frustrations, being on the board gave me access to records I hadn't seen before, including the full history of violations and fines. The pattern was clear: certain homeowners, particularly newer ones or those who had questioned Karren's authority, received disproportionately more violations. Some long-standing residents who were friendly with Karren hadn't received a single violation in years, despite obvious infractions. In late May, my public records request finally came through. The results were shocking even to me. In the year since I had moved in, police had been called to my address 16 times. 14 of those calls had come from the same number, Karren's. The reasons ranged from noise complaints to suspicious persons, property damage, and even one report of potential drug activity when I had friends over for a poker night. But that wasn't all. In the past 2 years, Karren had made over 60 calls to police about various addresses in Meadowbrook Estates. Almost none had resulted in actual reports or actions beyond the initial response. I shared this information with Lillian, who suggested I take it to a lawyer. "This goes beyond HOA overreach," she said. "This is misuse of emergency services." I consulted with an attorney specializing in property law, Lauren Anderson, who reviewed my documentation with growing concern. "What you're describing could constitute harassment through proxy," she explained. "By repeatedly making unfounded reports to police, this HOA president is essentially using law enforcement as a tool of intimidation. Additionally, many of the fines appear to have been imposed without proper notification or due process, as required by California law." Lauren suggested I compile a comprehensive record of all interactions, violations, and police calls, along with witness statements from neighbors who had experienced similar treatment. She also recommended I speak with the police department about the pattern of calls. In June, I did just that. I met with a sergeant at the Fresno Police Department, presenting my findings about the frequency and nature of calls from Karren. He took the information seriously. "We're actually already aware of this situation," he admitted. "When we get repeated calls from the same person that consistently turn out to be unfounded, it gets flagged in our system. This has been on our radar, but having this comprehensive documentation helps." He explained that making false reports to police is a misdemeanor in California, and when done repeatedly in an organized manner, it could potentially be charged as a more serious offense. I'm going to forward this information to our community liaison officer and potentially to the district attorney's office, he said. They may want to speak with you. Meanwhile, tensions on the HOA board continued to escalate. At our June meeting, I formally presented my findings about the selective enforcement of regulations. Walter looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Karren dismissed the data as misleading. Some homeowners simply require more guidance to maintain standards, she insisted. Guidance in the form of police showing up at their doors for imaginary violations, I countered. I have never made a false report, Karren said coldly. If I observe what appears to be a violation of community standards or potential criminal activity, I have not only the right but the responsibility to report it. The meeting ended with no resolution, but I could sense Walter's unease growing. After Karren left, he approached me in the parking lot. You need to be careful, he warned quietly. Karren doesn't respond well to challenges to her authority. The last board member who pushed back found his car vandalized and eventually moved away. Are you saying she damaged his property? I asked, shocked. Walter looked around nervously. I'm not saying anything specific, just be careful and maybe check your security cameras regularly. I took his warning seriously, upgrading my home security system and making sure my cameras covered all angles of my property. I also began backing up the footage to cloud storage daily, just in case. July brought new developments. I received a call from Detective Laura Mercer from the Fresno Police Department. Mr. Morgan, I'm investigating a pattern of potentially false police reports in your neighborhood, she explained. The sergeant mentioned you've compiled some relevant information. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop away from Meadowbrook. I brought my documentation, including the public records results and my timeline of events. Detective Mercer reviewed everything carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. This is concerning, she said finally. We take false reporting very seriously. It's not just about wasting police resources, though that's certainly an issue. It's also about the potential danger created by unnecessarily escalating situations. She explained that the district attorney's office would review the evidence to determine if charges were warranted. In the meantime, if you experience any retaliation or additional false reports, please contact me directly. Word of the police investigation somehow reached Karren, possibly through her connections at City Hall, which she often bragged about at HOA meetings. Her response was swift and vindictive. Within days, I received violation notices for unauthorized security equipment visible from community spaces, my doorbell camera, excessive vehicle movement. Apparently, I was entering and exiting my driveway too frequently, and failure to maintain frontage plantings to community standards. My perfectly healthy lawn was allegedly 0.25 inches too tall in one corner. I contested each violation through the proper channels, but also documented them as potential retaliation. I shared these new developments with Detective Mercer, who added them to her investigation file. August brought the annual Meadowbrook Community Picnic at the small park within our development. As a board member, I was expected to help with organization, which meant working alongside Karren. She was coldly professional, assigning me the most tedious tasks while she took credit for organizing the event. During the picnic, I noticed Karren watching me closely, particularly when I was speaking with other homeowners. When Leonard and I were discussing the upcoming board meeting, Karren accidentally spilled her drink on me while walking past. Oh dear, "How clumsy of me," she said with obviously false concern. "Perhaps if you weren't blocking the walkway with your conversation." I maintained my composure, knowing that's exactly what she wanted for me to lose my temper in public and damage my standing in the community. "No problem, Karren," I said calmly. "Accidents happen." September brought the investigation to its next phase. Detective Mercer called to inform me that the district attorney had reviewed the evidence and wanted to interview me personally. I met with Assistant District Attorney James Harrington, going over my experiences in detail. "We've been building a case file on Miss Williamson's activities," he explained. "Your documentation is particularly valuable because it shows the pattern and timeline so clearly." He explained that they were considering charges of organized false reporting, misuse of emergency services, and possibly harassment. "California takes this kind of behavior seriously," he said, "especially in the current climate where police resources are already stretched thin. Making dozens of false reports over a period of years isn't just annoying, it potentially puts other citizens at risk by diverting resources from genuine emergencies." The meeting left me hopeful that Karren would finally face consequences for her actions, but also anxious about potential backlash. My anxiety proved warranted. The next day, returning home from work, I found a notice taped to my door. Not an HOA violation this time, but a formal cease and desist letter from an attorney representing Karren personally, claiming I was engaged in defamation, harassment, and tortious interference with her HOA duties. The letter demanded I resign from the board immediately and stop spreading false information about her. I forwarded the letter to Lauren, my attorney, who responded with a strongly worded letter of her own, pointing out that truth is an absolute defense against defamation, and that documenting actual events could not constitute harassment. "This is a transparent attempt at intimidation," Lauren told me. "It's actually good news in a way. It shows she's worried about the investigation." October brought the most dramatic escalation yet. I woke one morning to find my front yard sign for a local charity event had been snapped in half. My security camera had caught the act Karren, at 5:30 a.m., deliberately breaking the sign before continuing her morning walk as if nothing had happened. I reported the vandalism to the police, providing the video evidence. Officer Rodriguez, who had responded to several previous calls at my address, shook his head as he watched the footage. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said. "Would you like to press charges for vandalism?" I hesitated, concerned about further escalating the situation, but ultimately decided that accountability was necessary. Yes, I would. Later that day, I watched from my home office window as a police car pulled up to Karren's house. The officers spoke with her for several minutes on her porch. Even from a distance, I could see her gesturing angrily. Finally, they handed her something, presumably a citation, and returned to their vehicle. The next HOA board meeting was tense to say the least. Karren arrived with her personal attorney, a stern-looking man who sat silently beside her, occasionally whispering in her ear. She refused to make eye contact with me throughout the meeting, addressing her comments to Walter or into the air between us. When we reached new business on the agenda, I formally presented a motion to review the HOA's policies on contacting law enforcement for community issues, suggesting that non-emergency matters should be handled through proper HOA channels rather than immediately calling police. Karren's face flushed red. "This is clearly a personal attack." Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, whispering something that made her stop mid-sentence. "The board president opposes this motion on procedural grounds," the attorney stated. This matter wasn't properly noticed on the agenda. He was technically correct. I had listed it simply as community safety discussion, but the reaction confirmed what I already suspected. Karren knew she was in legal trouble. The meeting ended without a vote on my motion, but I considered the public discussion a victory in itself. Several homeowners approached me afterward, expressing support and sharing their own stories of Karren's excessive police calls. November brought the culmination of the investigation. Detective Mercer called to inform me that the district attorney had decided to file charges against Karren for organized false reporting to law enforcement, a serious misdemeanor that could result in significant fines and even jail time if convicted. They'll be serving her with the charging documents tomorrow, Mercer explained. Given the history, they've decided to charge her with 63 counts, one for each verifiably false report she made over the past 2 years. I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, certainly, but also a strange sadness that things had escalated to this point. What had begun as neighborhood friction had ended with criminal charges. The news spread quickly through Meadowbrook Estates. Leonard called me that evening, having heard from another neighbor who worked at the courthouse. "Is it true?" he asked. "Karren's being charged?" "Yes," I confirmed. 63 counts of false reporting." Leonard let out a low whistle. "Can't say I'm surprised, but still, that's something." The next day, a special HOA board meeting was called. Karren was notably absent. Walter, looking both relieved and anxious, announced that Karren had submitted her resignation from the board, effective immediately. "Given the circumstances, we'll need to elect a new president," he explained to the unusually large crowd of homeowners who had gathered upon hearing the news. Nominations were opened. To my surprise, multiple neighbors nominated me. Despite my relatively short time in the community, my stand against Karren's abuse of power had earned me respect. The vote was nearly unanimous. I found myself elected as the new president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, with a mandate for reform. December brought Karren's first court appearance. I attended, along with several other homeowners who had been victims of her false reports. She looked smaller somehow, without her clipboard and authority, sitting beside her attorney in a conservative gray suit. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge set a trial date for February and ordered her to have no contact with any of the homeowners named in the reports, including me. As the new year of 2025 began, I focused on rebuilding the community that Karren had divided. We revised the HOA guidelines, removing many of the arbitrary and unnecessary restrictions while maintaining the essential rules that preserved property values and community standards. I instituted a new communication system, emphasizing collaboration rather than punishment. Violation notices became friendly reminders for first offenses, with a clear, fair process for addressing concerns. The neighborhood began to feel different, more relaxed, more friendly. People started spending more time in their front yards, chatting with neighbors. The community picnic in the spring had record attendance. Karren's trial in February was brief but revealing. The prosecution presented the mountain of evidence: dispatch records, officer testimony, security footage, and statements from numerous homeowners. Her defense attempted to argue that she genuinely believed she was reporting legitimate concerns, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. In the end, she was convicted on 57 of the 63 counts. The judge, noting the systematic nature of her actions and the resources wasted, sentenced her to 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay restitution to the police department for the cost of responding to her false reports a sum that exceeded $15,000. Perhaps most significantly, she was ordered to sell her home and move out of Meadowbrook Estates within 90 days, as the no-contact orders with multiple residents made it impossible for her to remain in the community. I saw Karren one last time as she was supervising movers loading a truck in front of her house in May. Our eyes met briefly across the street. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a cold stare before she turned away. As summer approached, the transformation of Meadowbrook was complete. The HOA still existed. It was necessary for maintaining certain common areas and ensuring basic standards, but it had become what it should have been all along: a support for the community rather than a weapon against it. My garden boxes returned, along with several others throughout the neighborhood. Children's bicycles and basketball hoops appeared. Front porches displayed wind chimes and personal touches that made each home unique, while still maintaining an overall pleasant aesthetic. Looking back on those 2 difficult years, I realized that what happened in Meadowbrook Estates wasn't just about one power-hungry woman or overzealous enforcement of petty rules. It was about the importance of community, the danger of unchecked authority, and the courage it takes to stand up against misuse of power. I still live in that same modest ranch-style home, now with a thriving vegetable garden in the back and wind chimes gently singing on my front porch. The police haven't been called to my address in months, and when I see a patrol car in the neighborhood, it's usually just an officer stopping to chat with residents during a community outreach drive. Homeownership still comes with its challenges, but living in fear of your neighbors shouldn't be one of them. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting your own rights, it's about creating the kind of community where everyone can feel at home,